November 19th, 1942, 5:15 a.m. Moscow time. The frozen steppe west of Stalingrad erupted with a cataclysmic roar, a sound that would echo through history. Over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces, meticulously massed and positioned along a 250-kilometer front, unleashed a barrage of such devastating intensity that the very ground heaved and shuddered. German soldiers in their forward positions, caught in the hellish inferno, found their own screams swallowed by the deafening crescendo of exploding shells. It was a symphony of destruction, marking the thunderous opening of Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive designed to ensnare and ultimately annihilate the entire German Sixth Army, then embroiled in the bitter urban struggle for Stalingrad. But our story isn't confined to that horrifying dawn. It delves deeper into a chilling revelation that unfolded later that same day in a discreet, sandbagged bunker nestled some 40 miles behind the rapidly collapsing front lines. There, a group of German staff officers, their faces etched with the strain of relentless combat, hunched over cluttered maps and reams of logistical data. As they completed a series of calculations, a horrifying truth emerged, stark and undeniable. The numbers didn't merely suggest a possibility. They screamed with absolute, mathematical certainty that they were doomed. Not might be doomed, not probably doomed, but were doomed. And in that terrifying realization, a cold dread settled over them, for they understood there was nothing, absolutely nothing, they could do to change it. To truly grasp how these seasoned, battle-hardened German generals arrived at such a horrifying conclusion, we must rewind 4 crucial months back to the sweltering heat of July 1942. In July 1942, the German summer offensive in southern Russia, codenamed Case Blue, appeared to be an overwhelming, unstoppable success. Army Group South, a formidable juggernaut of panzers and disciplined infantry, had shattered Soviet defenses, carving a relentless path toward the ultimate prize, the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus. Hitler, however, consumed by an insatiable ambition and a desire for both strategic and symbolic victory, made a decision that would forever alter the course of the Eastern Front, and indeed, the entire war. He split his mighty forces, dispatching one powerful army group southward to seize the vital oil, and another, the newly formed Army Group B, eastward toward Stalingrad, the industrial heart on the Volga River. This audacious decision to attack Stalingrad simultaneously with the Caucasus operation was met with immediate and vehement dissent among his most experienced and strategic commanders. General Franz Halder, the sharp-witted and pragmatic chief of the General Staff, argued passionately that dividing forces between two such critical objectives violated every fundamental principle of military strategy. His counsel was clear, logical, and historically sound. Secure the Caucasus and its invaluable oil first, consolidate resources, and then turn north to Stalingrad. But Hitler, blinded by his ideological fervor, his contempt for traditional military advice, and a personal vendetta against the city that bore Stalin's name, overruled them all. "Stalingrad bears Stalin's name," he reportedly declared, seeing its capture as both a personal affront and a psychological blow to the Soviet will. Halder, a man of integrity and principle who dared to speak truth to power, was summarily dismissed in September for his objections. The Führer made the decisions, and his word, however flawed, was absolute. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, had clawed its way into Stalingrad itself, a brutal, attritional struggle that had consumed months and countless lives. The once vibrant city had been utterly transformed into an apocalyptic wasteland, a skeletal landscape of shattered concrete, twisted steel, and the unburied dead. The battle had devolved into a brutal, grinding urban combat, a merciless, claustrophobic struggle fought block by block, building by building, and often room by agonizing room. German soldiers who had swept across France in a mere 6 weeks during the Blitzkrieg now found themselves spending weeks battling for control of a single factory, a single ruined grain elevator, a single apartment building. The casualties were staggering, a horrific toll exacted on both sides, transforming the cityscape into a veritable moonscape of rubble and corpses. Yet Paulus, a meticulous staff officer, more than a decisive field commander, driven by Hitler's unwavering directives, kept pushing. By mid-November, German forces controlled approximately 90% of Stalingrad. The Soviets, clinging desperately to existence, were compressed into a narrow strip along the Volga, their backs to the freezing river, barely holding on by a thread. Final victory seemed imminent, just days away. One more concerted push, the frontline commanders desperately hoped and believed, and Stalingrad would finally fall. Then, the weary, battered Sixth Army could at last rest, reorganize, and prepare for spring operations. This was the pervasive narrative, the desperate hope that sustained them through the freezing November nights. However, beneath this veneer of impending victory, a storm was silently brewing. On the morning of November 19th, German intelligence had indeed detected Soviet forces massing north and south of Stalingrad. Reconnaissance flights had captured images of troop concentrations, newly established supply dumps, and, ominously, artillery positions. Yet German command, perhaps lulled into a false sense of security by their earlier sweeping successes and critically underestimating the Red Army's recuperative powers and strategic acumen, assessed these as mere defensive preparations or, at most, limited local counterattacks. The very idea that the Soviets could launch a major encirclement operation, a Kesselschlacht, cauldron battle, on such a grand scale seemed utterly preposterous, impossible given their recent history of catastrophic losses and relentless retreat. The Red Army had been on the back foot since the German invasion in June 1941. Where could they possibly muster the forces for a large-scale, decisive offensive? The answer, as the Germans would soon discover to their horror and eternal regret, was everywhere. Stalin and the Soviet Stavka, High Command, had been meticulously hoarding reserves for months, conducting a masterclass in strategic deception. They pulled back forces from quiet sectors, painstakingly reconstituted shattered divisions, and painstakingly built up colossal ammunition and fuel stocks. They had been planning Operation Uranus since September, a grand strategic offensive, patiently waiting for the absolute opportune moment. That moment arrived precisely when German forces were critically overextended, their supply lines stretched to a dangerous breaking point, and the brutal Russian winter would begin its relentless assault, severely limiting German mobility and air superiority, especially over the vast, featureless steppe. That moment, for the German Sixth Army, was November 19th. The Soviet assault, when it came, struck with devastating force against German Allied forces, primarily Romanian armies, positioned north and south of Stalingrad. These were emphatically not Germany's elite troops. Romania, Italy, and Hungary had sent armies to support the German invasion of the Soviet Union, but they were generally less well-equipped, less experienced, and critically, far less motivated than their German counterparts. They held vast extended stretches of the front with wholly inadequate anti-tank weapons and dangerously weak defensive positions, often thinly spread across immense distances. The Soviet attack shattered these flimsy positions within hours. Romanian divisions, caught unprepared and outgunned, disintegrated. Soviet tank formations, spearheaded by the formidable T-34s, poured through the gaping holes in the front, racing westward and southward across the frozen steppe, then pivoting eastward to link up behind Stalingrad. The objective was chillingly clear, audacious in its scope, and devastating in its execution: to encircle the entire German Sixth Army and sever its vital lifelines of supply and reinforcement from the rest of the German front. At Sixth Army headquarters, a sense of controlled urgency, but not panic, initially prevailed. General Paulus received the first fragmented, often conflicting reports around 8 a.m. Romanian forces were under heavy attack. Some positions were being overrun. But Paulus, a meticulous staff officer renowned for his planning and adherence to procedure rather than a decisive field commander, had faced Soviet counterattacks before. His staff, operating under established protocols, prepared orders for German reserve divisions to move up and stabilize the situation. This seemed manageable, a tactical nuisance to be dealt with, a localized crisis that German ingenuity and strength would surely overcome. By noon, the reports grew more alarming, the situation visibly deteriorating with each passing minute. The Romanian front had completely disintegrated in multiple sectors. Soviet tank formations were advancing rapidly westward, their speed and sheer scale unprecedented. Yet Paulus, still clinging to the preconceived notions of a limited Soviet counterattack, failed to grasp the true magnitude of what was unfolding. He genuinely believed this was a major counteroffensive aimed at relieving Soviet forces within Stalingrad, not a strategic encirclement operation that threatened his entire army. His responses remained stubbornly tactical. Move this division here, reinforce that sector there. He was playing chess, while the Soviets were playing a much larger game of encirclement. At Army Group B headquarters, the more experienced and strategically astute Commander General Maximilian von Weichs, a general known for his realism, saw the terrifying bigger picture sooner. By early afternoon, intelligence reports, now flowing in with greater clarity and alarming consistency, showed Soviet forces moving in unmistakable encirclement patterns. This wasn't merely a relief attempt for the embattled Soviet defenders in Stalingrad. This was a trap, a massive, meticulously planned noose, and the Sixth Army was already deep inside it, tightening with every passing hour. Von Weichs, recognizing the immediate and existential threat, began preparing urgent orders for Paulus to break out westward immediately, while the encirclement was still forming and the Soviet ring was weakest. A desperate dash for freedom, costly but potentially army-saving. But before he could transmit them, orders from Hitler's headquarters, the Führerbunker, arrived, cold and unyielding, countermanding any such thought of retreat. Hitler's standing orders were unequivocal, steeped in dogma and pride. German armies do not retreat. Hold all positions. Any encirclement, the Führer's rigid doctrine dictated, could and would be broken from the outside, while forces inside held firm. This strategy had worked in several previous, smaller Soviet encirclement attempts on the Eastern Front, where nimble German forces had held out until relief columns broke through. Hitler, tragically, expected the same here, oblivious to the vastly different scale and intensity of the current Soviet offensive. What nobody at the higher command, blinded by dogma, geographic distance, and the Führer's unshakable delusion, understood yet was the sheer, unprecedented scale of the Soviet operation. This was not a hasty counterattack cobbled together with whatever forces were available. This was a carefully planned, massive offensive involving over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 13,000 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,100 aircraft. The forces executing the encirclement were colossal, exceptionally well supplied, and operating according to a detailed, comprehensive plan that had been refined over months of intense preparation. It was a strategic masterpiece of deception and overwhelming force, meticulously executed. By the evening of November 19th, the Soviet pincers were converging with terrifying speed. Northern and Southern forces were racing toward their designated link-up points, their relentless advance signaling the imminent closure of the trap. Back at 6th Army headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from urgency to a growing, palpable dread. Staff officers, their faces grim and pale, were frantically plotting Soviet positions on maps, the red arrows of the Soviet advance closing inexorably. They made frantic calculations. Where were the encircling forces? How fast were they moving? When, precisely, would they link up? And critically, how many German troops were about to be caught, irretrievably, inside the tightening noose? This is where the cold, hard mathematics became utterly unavoidable, a stark, merciless arbiter of fate. Staff officers meticulously counted divisions, battalions, support units. Every single soldier, every single man who would be caught inside if the encirclement closed. The numbers kept growing, escalating past any manageable figure. Not 50,000 troops, not 100,000. The 6th Army alone consisted of over 250,000 men. Add in attached units, the scattered Romanian remnants that had retreated in disarray into the nascent pocket, and essential support personnel, and the total climbed horrifyingly toward 300,000 souls. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, the astute chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front, though he arrived slightly later to the full realization of the scale, contributing to the overall intelligence picture, was part of these grim discussions, his calculations draining the color from his colleagues' faces. If the pocket closed, and it was now terrifyingly clear it would close, probably within 48 hours, over 280,000 German and Allied soldiers would be irrevocably trapped. The next calculation was even more devastating: supply. Supplying a force of that immense size by air would require approximately 500 tons of supplies daily, minimum, just to maintain a basic level of fighting effectiveness and survival. The Luftwaffe, German Air Force, had nothing even remotely close to that capacity. Germany's entire transport fleet in the East, often operating under immense strain, consisted of perhaps 500 Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, many in poor condition, and spread thinly across the vast front. Under perfect conditions, with no losses from enemy action or mechanical failure, flying maximum sorties, they might realistically deliver 250 tons per day, perhaps more optimistically, 150 tons under typical operational realities. And winter conditions on the Eastern Front, with its blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, and ever-present Soviet air and ground threats, were anything but perfect. One staff officer, his voice tight with grim realization, performed the mathematics aloud for all to hear, the numbers echoing like a death knell in the stark bunker. 280,000 men, minimum 500 tons daily supplies needed, maximum 150 tons daily that could be delivered. Deficit: 350 tons per day. Accumulated over weeks, this deficit would be utterly catastrophic. The 6th Army would slowly, agonizingly starve and freeze to death inside the pocket, long before any conceivable relief force could possibly break through. Another officer, desperate for any glimmer of hope, raised the obvious, agonizing question. Why not break out now, tonight, before the encirclement closes completely? Fight west through the Soviet forces still forming up. It would be costly, yes, immensely costly, but it would be possible. At least part of the 6th Army could escape, live to fight another day. The answer came, cold and firm, from General Arthur Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff, a dedicated and unyielding Nazi loyalist. Hitler's orders forbid retreat. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad. Reichsmarshal Göring has promised adequate air supply. Relief forces will break through from outside. This is not subject to debate. His words hung heavy in the air, a bureaucratic death sentence pronounced by rigid adherence to a madman's will. But the staff officers doing the calculations didn't need orders to understand what was coming. The mathematics were inexorable, unyielding, a cruel, precise equation of doom. An army of 280,000 men trapped in the unforgiving Russian winter with woefully insufficient supply would cease to exist as a fighting force within weeks. Not might cease, but would cease. This wasn't pessimism or defeatism. It was arithmetic. It was logistical reality confronting ideological delusion. Major Joachim Wieder, a keen intelligence officer present at these discussions, later wrote hauntingly about the atmosphere in that bunker. We sat there in silence, looking at the numbers on the maps and charts. We'd all done the calculations. Every officer there understood what they meant. The Sixth Army was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. We'd condemned over 250,000 men to death through a toxic mix of stupidity and ideology. By the morning of November 20th, the situation had deteriorated even further, accelerating past all German expectations. Soviet forces had advanced another 30 kilometers, their relentless push compressing the nascent pocket. The encirclement was tightening with terrifying speed. More German units, caught unaware, were being cut off and absorbed into the ever-shrinking perimeter. And critically, the precious, fleeting window for a breakout was closing rapidly, minute by agonizing minute. Within 24 hours, it would be too late. The Soviet ring would be complete, strong enough that breaking through would require abandoning all heavy equipment, all wounded soldiers, and most supplies. Even then, casualties would be catastrophic, transforming a breakout attempt into a suicidal charge. General Paulus, now fully aware of the dire straits his army was in, finally requested permission to break out. His message to Army Group headquarters was urgent, bordering on desperate. The Sixth Army could still fight its way west if ordered immediately. Delay another day, he warned, and escape would become an impossible fantasy. Army Group Commander von Weichs, grasping the impending catastrophe, supported the request and forwarded it to Hitler's headquarters with his strong, personal recommendation for immediate approval. Hitler, however, remained immovably entrenched in his fantasy. He refused. The chilling response came back within hours, swift and uncompromising. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad at all costs. Reichsmarshal Göring guaranteed adequate air supply. The army will defend in place while relief forces assembled for a breakthrough operation. There would be no retreat. The message ended with Hitler's typical bombastic rhetoric about willpower, unshakable determination, and the supposed inherent superiority of German soldiers who never surrendered. At Sixth Army headquarters, senior officers received this order in stunned, horrified silence. Some had served in the brutal trenches of World War I and remembered the horrors of encirclements on the Eastern Front. They knew, with a visceral certainty, what happened to trapped armies in the Russian winter. Others were younger, products of the Wehrmacht's early lightning successes, but they could read maps and, crucially, they could do arithmetic. The order, they collectively understood, was not a command, but a death sentence. Colonel Wilhelm Adam, Paulus's adjutant, later testified that the atmosphere was surreal, like watching a slow-motion catastrophe where everyone could see what was coming, but nobody could stop it. Officers who had been confident and professionally composed just days earlier were now hollow-eyed, their voices quiet, almost whispers, as if afraid to break the fragile silence of their impending doom. The realization was sinking in, cold and absolute. They were going to die in Stalingrad, and not quickly, heroically in battle, but slowly, agonizingly, from starvation, exposure, and the relentless cold. Some officers, driven by a desperate will to survive and save their men, advocated for disobeying Hitler's suicidal order. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commanding a corps inside the pocket, argued passionately that Hitler's order violated all military necessity and common sense. Paulus, he pleaded, should order a breakout on his own authority, accept the inevitable court-martial after the fact, but save the army. Better to be alive and court-martialed than dead and obedient, he reportedly declared. But Paulus, a traditional Prussian officer steeped in a rigid adherence to the chain of command, refused to disobey orders. Disobeying a direct order from the Führer was, for him, inconceivable, regardless of the horrifying consequences. Some historians view this unwavering obedience as a tragic manifestation of honor and duty. Others, more harshly, see it as moral cowardice, prioritizing unquestioning obedience to a deluded leader over the lives of the 280,000 men under his direct command. On November 22nd, the inevitable occurred. Soviet forces linked up at Kalach, approximately 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army, along with its attached Allied units, was now irrevocably trapped in a vast pocket roughly 50 kilometers across, a frozen, desolate island in a sea of Soviet power. Inside this grim cauldron were 284,000 German and Allied soldiers, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, countless artillery pieces, and enough supplies for perhaps 2 weeks at full consumption rates. The logistics calculations, grim as they were before, now became even more horrifyingly precise once the pocket's impenetrable boundaries were established. Staff officers frantically mapped supply requirements against the utterly inadequate airlift capacity. Even with Göring's bombastic and wildly optimistic promises, the mathematics simply did not work. A detailed, sobering analysis completed on November 23rd laid bare the brutal truth. Daily requirements were 500 tons minimum, 300 tons for food and basic supplies, 200 tons for ammunition and fuel. The Luftwaffe's maximum theoretical capacity, even under perfect conditions, was 300 aircraft sorties per day, with an average cargo per sortie of 1.5 tons, yielding a theoretical maximum daily delivery of 450 tons. But realistic delivery, accounting for brutal winter weather, the constant threat of Soviet fighters, and relentless anti-aircraft fire, was estimated at a mere 150 to 200 tons per day. The deficit was catastrophic, an inescapable death sentence by logistics. At best, the Sixth Army would receive 40% of its needed supplies. More realistically, it would be a mere 30%. Soldiers would be on starvation rations from day one. Ammunition would be severely rationed, limiting their ability to defend. Vehicle fuel would run out within weeks, rendering their tanks and transports useless. The Army, once a formidable fighting force, would gradually weaken, wither, and eventually disintegrate until Soviet forces could simply overwhelm it. Major Zitzewitz, an Army Group liaison officer, flew into the pocket on November 24th to assess the situation personally. What he found shocked him to his core. Frontline soldiers were already on severely reduced rations. Ammunition was being rationed. Every shot counted. Vehicle fuel was nearly exhausted, consigning tanks and trucks to static rolls. Medical supplies were critically low, condemning the wounded to slow, agonizing deaths. And morale, perhaps the most critical component, was collapsing as soldiers realized, with horrifying clarity, they had been abandoned. Zitzewitz returned to Army Group headquarters with a report that, bluntly called Göring's air supply, promises a criminal fantasy. The Luftwaffe simply couldn't supply the pocket. Any relief operation, he emphasized, would take weeks to organize, during which time the Sixth Army would deteriorate beyond any hope of recovery. The only solution, he reiterated, was an immediate breakout, regardless of the inevitable losses. His damning report was forwarded to Hitler's headquarters. The response was predictable, a chilling echo of the Führer's earlier pronouncements. Hold position. Relief forces were being assembled. Air supply would be adequate. German soldiers do not retreat. The bureaucratic death sentence was now being repeated, mechanically, endlessly, as if sheer repetition could somehow conjure impossible logistics into reality. Inside the pocket, German generals, facing the grim reality, were making their own increasingly desperate calculations about survival. How long could they possibly hold out? Some overly optimistic assessments suggested 2 months, if air supply miraculously improved. Pessimistic assessments were far grimmer, giving them only 6 weeks before the Army ceased to be combat effective. The most realistic assessments, grounded in the brutal numbers, gave them until late January before complete, irreversible collapse. These chilling calculations, like a contagious disease, leaked from the generals to junior officers and then to the enlisted men. Soldiers began to understand, with a growing sense of betrayal, that they had been written off. The Wehrmacht propaganda about fighting to the last man wasn't metaphorical. It was terrifyingly literal. They were expected to die in Stalingrad, not for victory, but because Hitler's pride wouldn't allow retreat, and his delusions about air supply completely ignored physical reality. Some units, driven by a primal urge to survive, began secretly preparing for breakout without orders, a desperate act of insubordination. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, a man of action and conviction, actually ordered his corps to begin withdrawing toward the pocket perimeter on November 25th, planning to break out on his own authority if Paulus remained paralyzed by obedience. But Paulus, still rigidly adhering to the chain of command, countermanded the order and threatened Seydlitz with court-martial. Discipline, however tenuously, still held. The relief operation, optimistically designated Operation Winter Storm, began its planning in late November. General Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's most capable and brilliant commander on the Eastern Front, was placed in charge. His daunting task, break through to Stalingrad with a powerful armored relief force, establish a viable supply corridor, and potentially evacuate the doomed Sixth Army. Manstein was a realist, a master of logistics and operational art. He did his own calculations meticulously and reached the exact same grim conclusions as everyone else who looked at the situation honestly. The Sixth Army was doomed if it stayed in place. Relief might temporarily reach the pocket, but holding a viable supply corridor through 100 kilometers of Soviet-controlled territory through the depths of winter was an impossible fantasy. The only truly viable solution, Manstein knew, was to use the relief operation as cover for a Sixth Army breakout. Both forces would fight west together, abandoning Stalingrad, but saving the majority of the army. But this, he understood, required Hitler's explicit approval, and Hitler would never, ever approve abandoning Stalingrad. The city bore Stalin's name. German propaganda had declared its capture essential, a symbol of ultimate victory. Retreat would be a massive political, psychological, and propaganda defeat, an intolerable humiliation for the Führer. So Hitler, stubbornly, insisted the Sixth Army hold while being relieved, after which it would remain in Stalingrad, supplied through the supposedly established corridor. The disconnect between Hitler's expectations and physical reality was absolute, total, a chasm of delusion. His most brilliant generals could see it. His meticulous staff officers could calculate it. Even junior lieutenants freezing in the bombed-out buildings of the pocket understood the simple, brutal mathematics of their impending doom. But Hitler's grip on decision-making was absolute, unyielding, and he was making decisions based on raw willpower, ideological fanaticism, and propaganda rather than sound logistics, military strategy, or objective reality. By early December, the Sixth Army's condition was deteriorating visibly and rapidly. Soldiers were on starvation rations of barely 300 calories per day, a meager existence barely enough to sustain life, nowhere near enough for men fighting for survival in sub-zero temperatures, often without adequate winter clothing. Horses, once vital for transport, were being slaughtered for their meager meat, a desperate measure of a starving army. Wounded soldiers were dying, not from their injuries, but from lack of basic medical supplies. Frostbite casualties were mounting to epidemic proportions because there was insufficient fuel to heat bunkers or provide warmth. The death sentence, calculated in that distant bunker on November 19th, was now being executed, day by agonizing day.